About 3 years ago, I live in a small studio apartment by myself. I lived there for 1 year in total, and in the entire time that I lived there, someone would knock on my door about once a week, sometimes a few times a week, and occasionally multiple times in the same night. This studio apartment was in an apartment building with only 6 units. There was an old lady who lived across from me, a young girl around the same age living above me, and an older couple living next door to her. The rest of the apartments were empty during my time there. Shortly after I moved in, I started to get knocks on the door at around 2 or 3 in the morning. The first time it happened, I was awake and watching a movie. I had gotten home really late from work and couldn't sleep. That's when I heard 3 firm knocks on the door. It was late. I'm a female and I live alone, so I definitely wasn't going to answer it. It was so loud that I was even scared to even look through the peephole in the door. My dog starts to bark, so I shush him and make him go into bed with me. We got under the covers, and I am absolutely terrified at this point. He's still barking, but the knocking didn't continue. I texted my boyfriend about it, but he was asleep, so he doesn't reply until the next morning. He tells me that it was probably just someone who had the wrong apartment, which makes sense. Weeks go by before anything else happens, but it definitely happened again. This time, I'm asleep, it's late, and I hear firm knocks on my door. My dog is barking, so I grab his collar and push him to his kennel, which is on the way to my front door. I go and look through the peephole, but there was no one standing in the front door. I'm really freaked out at this point. I go to the only window I have in the whole apartment, which faces the parking lot. There are no extra cars, bikes, motorcycles, etc. I called my boyfriend because at this point I was too scared to even go to sleep. He assures me that it must be someone who was looking for another apartment. What else could it be? Months and months pass, and this happens all the time now. I had spoken with the landlord on many occasions, and they assured me that it isn't them, and it's not their maintenance man. I begged to get out of my lease, but I wasn't able to. My boyfriend never spent the night. He's Catholic, but about 10 months into my lease, his family has a big birthday party for his younger sister, and he agrees to spend the night at my apartment, so that some family coming from in and out of town can sleep in his bed. We stayed up late watching movies, and again, at around 2 or 3 in the morning, there's a heavy loud knock on my door. I look at my boyfriend in a kind of, "See, I told you" sort of way. He gets up and opens the front door quickly, maybe thinking he can catch the person doing this, but no one was there. It's cold out that night and quiet. We didn't hear anyone walking, talking, getting into their car, nothing at all. We got back into bed and fell asleep. Around 5 a.m., someone knocks at the door once again. This time it's a quiet knock. My boyfriend decides to call the police. We call, they came out, and they searched around the vicinity of the place and said they didn't see anyone hanging around. The next morning as we were leaving, my neighbor whose front door is directly across from mine is also leaving. She doesn't speak English, so I have never talked to her. My boyfriend asked her in Spanish if she has had anyone knocked on her door. She tells him no, and asks why he's asking. He tells her for the last year almost, I have had someone knocked on my door at least weekly. She tells us she's sorry, and she didn't see or heard anything, but she'll let us know if she does. A couple of weeks later, I let my landlord know I would not be renewing my lease. My boyfriend asked if we could move into a new place together, and I happily agreed. A month later, the night before I moved, I was up late packing up so I could be there early in the morning and be ready. My dog was already at the new place with my boyfriend, so I was all alone. That's when there were 3 knocks, and then it stopped. I flicked on my porch light on and looked through the peephole. Again, no one was there. I felt a little less scared knowing I wouldn't sleep here again. I never found out who was knocking on my door or why. To this day, it completely baffles me. I've thought of every possible reason and have no idea why. For an entire year, someone would continuously knock on my door, almost weekly. After I moved out, it then stopped and never happened again. About 20 years ago, my boyfriend and a couple of his friends had an upper unit of an old 4-unit apartment building in a slightly sketchy urban area with sizable homeless population. It was a dark and filthy attic above the apartment that could only be accessible from my boyfriend's unit. It had no lights in it, so even in the daytime you would need a flashlight to walk through it. There were 2 full-size doors with wooden staircase to access the attic, one on either end of his long apartment. I should also mention that my boyfriend's roommates were not the brightest buds and would not always lock the apartment door during the day when they were home. Because of this, my boyfriend left his bedroom door locked as a habit. One night, his roommates came home drunk and completely forgot to lock the door overnight, and my boyfriend woke up to some medhead tapping on his bedroom door. But that's another story for another day. On this night, my boyfriend and I had been alone in the apartment for hours, with the front door being locked. That's when we heard a distinct knocking near the back of the apartment. We went to investigate, and it's coming from the attic door. Someone is in the attic knocking on the door. This is distinct knocking in a recognizable pattern, just like you knock casually on a friend's door. The door didn't look to be locked, and whoever was on the other side of the door would have known that, so their knocking didn't make sense. My boyfriend wanted it to open the door, and I just wanted it to get the fuck out of there. We whispered and argued about it for a few seconds while the knocker kept knocking. And then I tell him I'm leaving and heading for the front door, and he follows me, probably because I was worried I'll walk home alone in the dark. I also live about a mile away, and we don't own cars. He probably also didn't want to be alone with the person in the attic. As we were about to walk out of the front door, someone starts knocking on the other attic door, in front of the apartment. Unless they sprinted up the attic steps and back down the other attic steps, there's no way they could have gotten there so fast, and we would have heard their footsteps. Plus, it's dark up there, and we didn't see any light coming from the door. There must have been 2 people, one knocking on either door. We just left and spent the night at my place. My boyfriend didn't even call the cops. He doesn't believe in ghosts, and I can't explain his logic for not calling the police. But we were poor college students and owned nothing of value, as pretty much everything in the apartment was just stuff we found on the street. So that was that. One night, I got a knock on my door. I live in a small studio apartment by myself at the time, and barely knew anyone in the entire apartment unit, including my only neighbor. I lived next to a corner unit and had a hallway on the other side, so his unit was the only one sharing a wall with mine. I opened the door, and it was my landlord, who promptly asked if I'd been hearing loud noises next door. It was a noise complaint. No, I barely hear them at all. I stepped outside into the hallway and saw him for the first time. He was a short, stocky guy with a few prominent warts wearing a hoodie. The apartment building was mostly low-rent housing, and I had no reason to distrust this guy after living next to him and barely hearing a peep for a near plus. So I vouched for him, because I don't like seeing landlords use complaints as an excuse to kick people out. Big mistake. I go back inside, telling the guy to knock on my door again if that ever happens so I can help out. I go back to whatever I was doing, and another knock was on my door. This time it was a neighbor. He says I'm just feeling rattled. I could ask you if you can come over. I can make tea. I politely decline, saying that I was in the middle of something. 30 minutes went by, and another knock. I've got some games if you want to play those. We can smoke and hang out. Please, I just need someone, he pleaded. Again, said no, and yet another knock, and finally he wore down my patience. Fine, I'll come over for a little bit, but I'm bringing my own drink. I grab my pepper spray and stuff it into my back pocket just in case. His room was dimly lit and full of large surreal paintings that depicted people in twisted positions. He had tons of keepsakes, everything from dolls to woodcut idols, nailed up into the wall. He clearly didn't get a lot of visitors. He starts brewing some tea and asks again if I want some. I politely decline, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I notice it. A ball-peen hammer sitting directly next to the tea kettle. I eye that thing like a hog, making sure his hand never strayed from the kettle. I'm a shedding kind of girl, so I'm not exactly strong or anything, and he could have easily overpowered me. I tried to pull it out of my mind, but the atmosphere kept sending me into the fight or flight mode. Something about this guy was wrong, and my brain was yelling me to leave, but for some reason, I stayed. He and I started talking about art, and he seemed oddly fixated on the concepts of masculine as dominant and female as the artistic supplement self. I'm an illustrator and not super familiar with high art, so I tried to make normal conversation about his painting and his job, but I kept steering back to his fascination with gender dimorphism. Then he says, "Want to see something I'm working on?" A chill runs down my spine. For some reason I say, sure. He then boots up his desktop and shows me what he calls a machine. It's a video shot around the city. It contained the occasional shots of random subway walls and buildings, old machinery, and then it starts showing random people from off the street. It was shot from a camera phone, and the angle suggested that those people weren't aware that he was filming them. I recognized the locations because all the places were relatively nearby. This continued for 10 minutes until I have finally had enough. I said, "Sorry man, I really gotta get back. My friends are waiting for me." "Oh, but the tea isn't done yet." He walks over to the tea kettle again. The hammer's still right there on the stove, next to his hand. I started walking to the door, and at this point, my brain was telling me to get the fuck out of there, even though nothing was especially a giant red flag so far. Just an eccentric painter guy with some weird hobbies who really wanted me to stay over. Thankfully, I managed to politely make my escape. Mind you, this man is my neighbor, and has been the entire time I lived there. I call up a nearby friend and asked him to stay for the night, but that didn't matter. This is where I live. He knew exactly where I live, and that I lived alone. The next morning, I returned to my place. I felt awful. Had barely slept through the night prior, so I decided to take a shower, and that's when I saw it. A small hole in the tile wall, just big enough to see through. This bathroom shared the same wall with him. How long had that been there? I looked through it, and as clear as day, I could see back into that dingy apartment. I promptly covered it. After that incident, I have never heard anything from him again. No knocks or anything. 2 months later, I decided to move. The landlord's brother, who was filling in for me for a week while I was moving out, asked me why was I moving. I mentioned that I had a bad experience with someone in the building, and I didn't want to rat him out or anything, but the brother already knew who it was. "Oh, him? Don't worry about him. He's harmless." How did the landlord's brother, who barely even operated in this building before, know about my neighbor? Had someone else had a similar experience with him? Was this common enough that even he was aware? I couldn't stop thinking about the hole in the shower, the hammer, the dolls nailed up to the walls, his machine, and why was this guy so sure about him being harmless? I want to believe that he was just some eccentric artist with some strange fascination, but that old growling feeling just wouldn't go away. Either way, it's one of the most scariest experiences that I had to encounter during my stay in that apartment.